Hello, everyone. I'm going to let those in the waiting room connect to audio, but welcome to everyone who is joining us live and also for those watching the recording of this session. Hi, my name is Gabrielle Liu, and I'm joined by my colleague, Wendy Brem. We're both representing the Educating All Learners Alliance content team. And so if you're unfamiliar with the Educating All Learners Alliance, or ELA, as we like to call it, we were established as an uncommon alliance in early 2020 in response to COVID-19, as we saw there would be a gap in services provided for students with disabilities in the transition to remote learning. And so since that inception, we have curated a resource library, webinars such as this, podcasts, and more resources, especially for educators to help them best support students. So I know I mentioned we focused on the transition to remote learning, but of course, since then, we've provided resources through that adaptation from hybrid learning to now for most people back to in-person school. And so we recently started a monthly series of this webinar where we share the top resources from the previous month within our resource library. And then we also give more themed resource recommendations that you can use for this following month. So since we're now in October 2021, we're going to give you the top resources from September. And then we're also theming this month around family engagement. So we'll give you some of those. And we also, like I said, we recently started this. So we have 2 months of recording shared on our YouTube channel, which you can find just Educating All Learners. But the general structure of this session, so we'll go through and list and give you descriptions of all the top resources that we recommend to you. And then we'll open at the end if you have any questions for those that are with us live on any of the resources that we mentioned. So I will go ahead and pass it over to Wendy to get started on our case studies.
Awesome, thank you. So our first case study talks about the push-in model in a virtual classroom. We had a speech and language pathologist sharing her recommendations for how she implemented the push-in model in her virtual classroom. This case study provides some of her own experiences and a lot of different strategies. I found it really helpful because it shows both in-person and distance learning and how the same tools and strategies can be approached in both circumstances, especially now that we're transitioning back into the in-person learning environment and still having some students remote. So this really helps for speech and language pathologists from both angles. The next case study we have talks about transforming the parent-teacher relationships in remote learning. And the person who wrote this case study's name is Brittany Moser, and she partners with families on a regular basis to talk about students who have autism spectrum, who are on the autism spectrum. And it's really hard to create strong parent-teacher relationships, but especially with students with disabilities, we want them to be strong. We want an open channel of communication, and we want to make sure, especially in these times, that students with disabilities needs are met, especially those on the autism spectrum, because it's really hard to implement what you learn at home if you don't have strong communications between parents and teachers. All right, let's go to the next one. This one is really interesting, and I found it applicable across all spaces. It talks about having a stronger connection to your school community, and really gives people in leadership the opportunity to talk to their teachers and kind of figure out what's going on both at home and in the school. And with some schools having a hybrid model now, it's really important that we figure out how we're connecting all of our students, all of our teachers in these times. All right, and the next one is a really interesting applicable lesson that we can use for virtual writing. And when we think about writing and teaching writing and literature and making it inclusive for all students, it can be tricky to find lessons and tools and strategies that work for everyone. And this lesson really is helpful for them. I'll take some questions now, if there are any, before moving on to the resources that are not case studies, if you have any.
And we will also share in the recording of this video, we'll provide a link to a document where you can view all these resources and link to them as well.
Yeah, so if no one has any questions, we'll move on to the resources. We have some really interesting topics coming up. All right, the first resource talks about why having too many or too few special education students matters. The person who wrote this article's name is Kara Arundel, and she helps us understand why this matters and how it can be identified. There's different ways to address whether you have too many or too few special education students, and kind of identifying why and how these students are being identified as needing special education services. And if you're having more than what you should, kind of figuring out whether or not your programs are inclusive, whether or not all students are getting what they need. And I think at the bottom line of all of this is designing for the margins and making sure your classrooms are accessible to all. The next article provides teachers with digital learning tips that can be used for students with and without disabilities across the sector. And the last resource we have talks about how state level mass policy prohibitions impact students with disabilities. On both sides, students who cannot wear a mask that have additional needs or different disabilities, and students who don't have disabilities that choose not to wear a mask, and how that affects immunocompromised students and students with disabilities. So it provides an outlook on both sides. This article was written by the Center for Learner Equities, Paul O'Neill and Wendy Tucker. And then we have some topic-related resources for parent engagement for October. The last month focused on student engagement, so now we're kind of pivoting to parent engagement. The same resource we discussed a little bit earlier, having an opportunity for stronger connection to your school community, is useful for teachers and parents alike. We also have another article that talks about communication barriers, which is important. It really gets down to the nitty-gritty of where the challenges are and how we can address them, and how we can make for open channels of communication and both parents and teachers feeling heard and like they're involved in the student's education. That is all I have for now. If anyone has any other questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, so we'll pause for questions, but I did want to share that these and more resources on similar topics you can find in the resource library on educatingalllearners.org. And so we have the search tabs there. So whether you're a paraprofessional, a general educator, special education teacher, school admin, you can find some resources there. So thank you all for joining. Pause for any questions.
Yeah, and if there's a specific resource or topic you're looking for, we keep track of what's not being found on the resource library. So if you search for something and you can't find it, we'll know on our end and we'll do our best to create a resource for you.
Yes.
All right, if no one has any questions, I guess we'll wrap up. But again, thank you for your time. It was nice talking to you guys.
Yes, thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.